Hey guys, tonight we're going beyond the raids to explore how the Vikings weaponized human sexuality in ways that shaped medieval Europe and still echo in our understanding of power today. You've seen the movies? Long ships cutting through morning mist, warriors with painted faces charging into battle, the clash of steel and the roar of conquest. But Hollywood always cuts to black, right, when the real story begins. What happened after the adrenaline faded and the survivors were left to deal with the aftermath? The Vikings didn't just raid and leave, they created systems. Brutal, calculated systems that turned human intimacy into weapons of war and tools of social control. They developed legal frameworks around sexuality that were both remarkably progressive and deeply disturbing, often within the same household. So before we dive into what really happened when the battle smoke cleared, take a moment to like this video if you're ready for some uncomfortable historical truths. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see our community gathering from around the world for these deeper explorations. Now settle in wherever you are. Dim the lights, get comfortable, because this isn't the Viking story you've been told. This is what happened after the blood dried. Astrid the merchant stood in her husband's great hall, holding a divorce document that would have been impossible anywhere else in medieval Europe. She was legally ending her marriage because Eric had worn a shirt that showed too much chest, behavior she considered unmanly and grounds for immediate separation under Viking law. Within the hour, she would walk across the same hall to inspect 3 Irish slave girls her husband's raiders had brought back from their latest expedition. She would examine their teeth, check their muscle tone, and help determine which one would best serve the household's intimate needs. Astrid embodied one of history's most disturbing contradictions. A medieval feminist who fought for her own rights while actively participating in the systematic oppression of other women. She lived in a society that created unprecedented freedoms for some while denying basic humanity to others, often within the same household. Picture a legal system that gave women rights that wouldn't appear elsewhere in Europe for another 500 years. Free Viking women could divorce their husbands for sexual inadequacy, inherit property, run businesses, and even propose marriage to men they desired. They enjoyed legal protection against unwanted sexual advances that was remarkably progressive for the 9th century. The Icelandic law codes spell out these protections with remarkable precision. A woman could legally leave her husband if he was too gentle in bed, if he wore clothing she considered feminine, or if he failed to defend her honor adequately. She could take her property with her and remarry without requiring anyone's permission. Some Viking women became wealthy merchants, controlling trade routes and commanding their own ships. Others inherited vast territories and arranged marriages for their male relatives. The sagas document women who held political power that would have been unthinkable in Christian Europe. But here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. These same legal codes that protected free women's sexual autonomy explicitly stated that enslaved women were property to be used as their owners saw fit. Astrid's morning routine reveals the brutal efficiency of this divided system. After finalizing her divorce, a process that took less time than modern couples spend arguing about dinner plans, she moved seamlessly to managing her household's human property. The 3 Irish girls stood naked in her kitchen while she evaluated them with the clinical precision of someone purchasing livestock. She checked their teeth for disease, examined their hands for calluses that might indicate previous hard labor, and asked her husband's men about their virginity and compliance during the journey. "This one," she said, pointing to a girl who couldn't have been older than 16, "will serve in the main hall. The others can work the fields until winter." The casual tone she used was the same one she'd employed while negotiating trade agreements with merchants from distant lands. The girl she'd selected would be available for sexual use by any free man in the household. Astrid would supervise this arrangement with the same managerial efficiency she brought to running her business enterprises. How did women like Astrid reconcile fighting for their own freedom while denying it to others? Modern psychologists recognize this as a form of moral compartmentalization, the ability to apply different ethical standards to different groups of people based on arbitrary distinctions. Astrid genuinely believed she deserved legal protection from unwanted sexual advances. She also genuinely believed that enslaved women existed primarily for others' sexual use. In her mind, these weren't contradictory positions, they were simply different rules for different categories of people. The Viking legal framework supported this thinking by creating distinct classes of humanity. Free Norse women were people with rights. Enslaved women were property with functions. The same legal code that made forcing sex on Astrid a capital crime made forcing sex on her slaves a matter of property management. Perhaps most disturbing was how Viking free women convinced themselves they were protecting enslaved women while exploiting them. Astrid would often speak of her slave girls with what sounded like maternal concern, ensuring they were fed, clothed, and treated kindly by the men who used them. She would intervene if she thought someone was being too rough, not from concern for the slave's well-being, but from worry about damaging valuable property. She would sometimes give them small gifts or allow them extra food, gestures that made her feel benevolent while never questioning the system that made such benevolence necessary. The enslaved women learned to show gratitude for these small mercies, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining the illusion that their mistresses were kind protectors rather than complicit oppressors. Astrid's feminist achievements were directly funded by the profits from sexual slavery. The trade routes she controlled, the property she inherited, the economic independence that allowed her to divorce unsuitable husbands, all of it depended on a system that treated other women as commodities. Her business success came partly from managing her household's enslaved women efficiently, ensuring they provided maximum value through both labor and sexual services. She took pride in running a profitable operation, viewing her management skills as evidence of her capability and intelligence. The wealth generated by this system allowed her to live independently, travel freely, and exercise political influence. Her liberation was built on others' oppression, and she understood this connection clearly enough to defend it when necessary. Astrid's daughter grew up watching this system operate with seamless efficiency. She learned that women's rights were important for the right kind of women. She absorbed the lesson that fighting for equality was virtuous, as long as that fight didn't extend to people who looked different, spoke different languages, or belonged to different social classes. This selective application of feminist principles became embedded in Viking culture, creating generations of women who demanded justice for themselves while participating in systematic injustice toward others. The contradiction became so normalized that questioning it would have seemed as strange as questioning the weather. Today we see similar patterns in corporate boardrooms where female executives fight glass ceilings while ignoring the exploitation of women in their supply chains. In social movements where privileged feminists focus on their own issues while marginalizing the voices of women facing different forms of oppression. The psychology that allowed Astrid to advocate for her own rights while denying them to others operates whenever people create moral hierarchies that justify treating some humans as more deserving of dignity than others. The mechanisms are the same even if the specific applications have evolved. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt's research on bias and dehumanization helps explain how intelligent, otherwise moral people can participate in systematic oppression while maintaining their self-image as ethical individuals. The Vikings weren't uniquely capable of moral compartmentalization, they were displaying human tendencies that persist today. Viking society had discovered something that modern political strategists understand. Giving some members of an oppressed group privileges can be an effective way to prevent unified resistance. By elevating free women above enslaved women, they created a class of potential allies who had more to gain from supporting the system than from opposing it. Astrid and women like her became stakeholders in Viking expansion because conquest brought them more property, more slaves, and more opportunities for economic advancement. Their liberation wasn't threatening to Viking male power, it was essential to maintaining it. This created a feedback loop where successful Viking women became advocates for the very system that oppressed other women, using their own achievements as evidence that the society was fair and progressive. The next time someone points out contradictions in modern feminist movements, or when discussions arise about privileged women who ignore less privileged women's struggles, remember Astrid standing in her great hall, simultaneously exercising unprecedented legal rights and supervising the sexual exploitation of enslaved girls. Her story reminds us that progress for some can coexist with oppression of others, and that the same people who fight courageously for their own freedom can become complicit in denying freedom to those they consider fundamentally different from themselves. The Vikings created a system where women's liberation and women's oppression weren't opposite forces, they were complementary parts of the same social machine. And this contradiction extended beyond just the treatment of enslaved women. Viking society had also developed complex attitudes towards same-sex relationships that created sexual hierarchies so intricate they required legal scholars to navigate, rules that could celebrate sexual conquest while condemning sexual submission, often within the same individual relationship. Because in Viking culture, it wasn't what you did sexually that mattered. It was whether you did it from a position of power or submission. Cormac, King of Leinster, had made what would become the worst mistake of his life. Not a tactical error in battle or a failed alliance with neighbouring kingdoms. Something far worse. He'd been captured alive by Viking raiders, and as he knelt in the mud beside their longship, death would have been mercy compared to what they were planning. The Vikings weren't going to kill him quickly. They weren't even going to torture him in ways that would leave scars his enemies could see. What they were about to do was far more devastating. They were going to destroy his soul while leaving his body perfectly intact, ensuring that even if he somehow escaped, he could never return home with his honor intact. They called it the shame stroke, and Cormac was about to understand why some men begged for death rather than endure what he was about to experience. Picture a military strategy where destroying someone's reputation was considered more effective than simply killing them. The Vikings had perfected psychological warfare to an art form, understanding that breaking a man's spirit was far more valuable than ending his life. A dead enemy becomes a martyr. A humiliated enemy becomes a living warning. The Vikings had developed what military strategists today would recognize as sophisticated psychological operations. They understood that the right kind of public humiliation could destroy not just an individual but the entire power structure that individual represented. The Vikings forced Cormac to his knees in front of their gathered warriors, but they didn't draw their swords for execution. Instead, they produced a blade designed for something far more personal, a thin, sharp knife meant for precision work, not killing. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every witness, Viking and Irish alike. They flipped him onto his stomach, and with calculated theatrical precision, they cut his buttocks, a ritual they called nidhug, or shame stroke. It wasn't deep enough to kill, but it was placed with surgical accuracy to symbolize anal penetration. The message was unmistakable. Cormac had been sexually conquered. In Viking culture, this marking transformed him from a feared king into something less than a man. The physical wound would heal, but the psychological damage was designed to be permanent. Here was the genius of Viking psychological warfare. They didn't need to actually engage in the sexual act to achieve the symbolic victory. The shame stroke delivered all the social destruction of sexual humiliation without requiring the Vikings to compromise their own masculine status. Cormac was now marked as sexually passive, which in Viking society meant he'd lost not just his masculinity, but his basic human dignity. Even if he escaped, even if he raised an army and returned for revenge, everyone who saw those scars would know what they meant. The Vikings understood something that modern psychological warfare specialists study today. The most effective attacks target not the body, but the victim's sense of self. Physical wounds heal. Psychological wounds can last lifetimes. This wasn't random cruelty. The shame stroke was part of a sophisticated system of sexual hierarchy that governed Viking society with the precision of written law. Being marked as sexually passive could strip a man of legal rights, property ownership, and even the ability to testify in court. The Icelandic sagas document dozens of cases where men lost everything because they were publicly marked as sexually conquered. Some committed suicide rather than live with the shame. Others became wandering outcasts, living reminders of Viking dominance that would terrify other potential enemies. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites across medieval Europe shows signs of this ritualized violence. Bodies bearing the distinctive marks of the shame stroke, positioned in ways that maximized the psychological impact on anyone who discovered them. But the Vikings weren't finished with just marking Cormac. The shame stroke was designed to destroy not just the individual, but the entire community that had placed their trust in that person's leadership. When word spread back to his kingdom that their king had been sexually humiliated, it didn't just damage his reputation, it called into question the entire system that had elevated him to power. If the gods had truly favored him, how could he have been reduced to such degradation? His own warriors began to doubt. His nobles started considering new alliances. His enemies saw weakness where they once saw strength. The Vikings had achieved through one symbolic act what years of traditional warfare might not have accomplished: the complete psychological collapse of an enemy power structure. Cormac faced a choice that no human being should have to make. He could try to return home, knowing that everyone who saw him would know exactly what those scars represented. He could attempt to rebuild his authority while carrying the visible mark of his sexual conquest. Or he could disappear, becoming one of the countless men who simply vanished from historical records after encountering Viking psychological warfare. Some historians believe entire bloodlines ended not from battlefield deaths but from leaders who chose exile over the impossible task of ruling while marked as sexually conquered. The cruelest part? The Vikings genuinely believed they were showing mercy. In their worldview, they were giving him the chance to live, even if that life came with conditions that made death seem preferable. Today, military psychologists recognize what the Vikings instinctively understood: that attacks on sexual identity can be more devastating than physical torture. The shame stroke created what modern researchers call moral injury, psychological damage that occurs when someone's fundamental sense of self is destroyed. Contemporary research on betrayal trauma helps explain why the shame stroke was so effective. It didn't just inflict pain, it forced victims to carry the visible evidence of their humiliation, making recovery impossible as long as the scars remained. The Vikings had accidentally discovered principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychological warfare specialists until the 21st century. The shame stroke influenced medieval European politics in ways historians are still discovering. Treaties that make no strategic sense become clear when one realizes that one party's leader had been marked as sexually conquered. Sudden collapses of powerful kingdoms start to make sense when one understands that their rulers couldn't command respect after being publicly humiliated. This practice shaped how medieval societies understood the relationship between sexuality and political power, creating frameworks that influenced European law and social structure for centuries. The next time someone discusses the psychological impact of public humiliation, or when news breaks about leaders whose careers ended not from scandals, but from the way those scandals were perceived, remember Cormac kneeling in the mud beside a Viking longship. His story, and the stories of countless other leaders who faced the shame stroke, reminds us that political power has always been inseparable from personal dignity, and that the most effective weapons aren't always the ones that draw blood. The Vikings understood that destroying someone's sense of self was often more valuable than simply ending their life. They turned psychological warfare into a precision instrument, and the scars they left shaped medieval Europe in ways that no sword ever could. And the shame stroke was just one tool in the Viking arsenal of sexual humiliation. Because in their society, the line between honor and degradation wasn't just personal, it was legal, with consequences that could literally determine whether a man lived or died based on a single insult about his sexual performance. Sometimes 3 words spoken in anger could give someone the legal right to kill with no consequences whatsoever. Picture yourself as a foreign correspondent sent to document a culture that operates by completely different rules. Now imagine discovering that some of those rules involve practices so disturbing that your editors back home will spend decades questioning whether you actually witnessed them. That's exactly what happened to Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a Muslim diplomat from Baghdad, on a September morning in 922 AD along the Volga River. He thought he was simply documenting Viking customs for his sophisticated audience back home. Instead, he was about to witness something that would redefine his understanding of how human societies could blend love and violence into what they called sacred duty. The Viking chieftain was dead. His funeral was about to begin, and Ahmad had no idea that he was about to document one of the most disturbing religious practices in human history. Now, Ahmad was no stranger to cultural differences. He'd traveled thousands of miles from the refined courts of the Islamic world, where funerals were dignified affairs, bodies washed, wrapped in white cloth, buried facing Mecca within hours of death, clean, respectful, spiritually efficient. The Vikings, however, had developed what you might call a more interactive approach to sending their dead into the afterlife. Think of it as the difference between a quiet memorial service and a week-long spiritual transaction that required active participation from the living. The Vikings believed that sexual energy could be transferred from the living to the dead, that intimate contact could channel life force across the boundary between worlds. From their perspective, what Ahmad was about to witness wasn't violence disguised as religion. It was the most sacred ceremony their culture had developed, a spiritual technology for ensuring their chief's power in Valhalla. But perspective doesn't change what actually happened. When the Vikings gathered the dead chieftain's slave girls, Ahmad expected the typical reassignment of property that he'd seen in other cultures. Instead, they asked a question that made his blood run cold. Which one of you will die with him? A young woman, perhaps 19, stepped forward with the kind of hopeful expression you might see on someone volunteering for a community project. "I will," she said in Norse, her voice carrying genuine excitement. The Vikings cheered. They lifted her up like she'd just announced her engagement, and in their minds, perhaps she had. She genuinely believed she was about to become her master's eternal companion in the warrior's paradise, where mead flowed like rivers and battles raged without consequence. She had no idea what the next 6 days would bring. This wasn't random barbarism playing out in some backward corner of the world. The Vikings had spent generations developing this ritual, codifying it into their religious practices with the same precision that other cultures used to build cathedrals or write poetry. Every detail served a spiritual purpose that made perfect sense within their worldview. Modern archaeologists keep finding evidence that confirms Ahmad's account. Ship burials across Scandinavia, mass graves in Sweden, young women buried with high-status men, often showing signs of ritual death. What once seemed like impossible propaganda has become documented fact. For 6 days, Ahmad watched as the volunteer was treated like a sacred vessel. The tribesmen lined up, each believing he was transferring his spiritual essence through her body to their dead chief. They whispered to her, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." She grew increasingly intoxicated. Wine, fermented mare's milk, and other substances that made her eyes glassy and distant. Between the ceremonies, she would laugh and sing, describing visions of Valhalla, telling everyone how she could see her master waiting for her in the great hall. The other slave girls avoided her now. They understood something Ahmad was slowly realizing, that her journey to paradise had a very earthly, very final destination. Imagine being Ahmad, trying to maintain scholarly objectivity while watching a young woman prepare for what she believed was divine marriage, knowing that she was actually counting down to her own execution. On the 6th day, the ceremony reached its climax. Ahmad's documentation becomes almost clinical in its precision, though you can sense his horror bleeding through the scholarly language. Then 6 men went into the pavilion, and each had intercourse with the girl. Then they laid her at the side of her master. An elderly woman the Vikings called the Angel of Death approached the funeral ship. She moved with practiced authority. This wasn't her first time performing. what they considered the ultimate act of mercy. The girl was given one final drink, told to look once more into the afterlife where her master waited. Then the angel of death pulled a cord tight around her neck, while simultaneously driving a knife between her ribs. The Vikings believed this double death, strangulation and stabbing, would ensure her spirit made the crossing successfully. The ship was set ablaze while the tribe chanted prayers for the successful delivery of their collective life force to the realm of the dead. Ahmad stood on that riverbank, watching smoke rise into the Russian sky, trying to process what he'd witnessed through the lens of his own sophisticated culture. These weren't monsters. They were grieving people who loved their chieftain so much they were willing to send part of themselves to care for him in death. The young woman had genuinely believed she was entering divinity. The men thought they were performing sacred duty. The angel of death moved with the gentle authority of someone easing suffering, not causing it. And yet, from any perspective outside their belief system, what Ahmad had witnessed was the systematic grooming and murder of a 19-year-old girl who had been convinced that death was marriage and rape was worship. Today we recognize what Ahmad documented as one of the most complex examples of how religious belief can transform violence into sacred duty. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were human beings who had developed cultural practices that allowed them to commit atrocities while maintaining their moral self-image. Dr. Sarah Chen at the University of Oslo puts it bluntly: every archaeological dig confirms more of Ibn Fadlan's testimony. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic religious practice that shaped Viking expansion for centuries. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's testimony survived because he had the courage to document what he saw without sanitizing it for his audience's comfort. His account, preserved in medieval manuscripts, gives us a window into practices that shaped the medieval world in ways we're still discovering. The next time someone romanticizes Viking culture or talks about the good old days, remember Ahmad standing on that riverbank, watching a young woman's death being celebrated as the highest honor their society could bestow. His witness ensured that history would remember not just the warriors and the conquest, but the cost paid by people whose names we'll never know, whose deaths were considered sacred by those who claimed to love them. And Ahmad's account was just the beginning. What he witnessed was part of a larger system that governed every aspect of Viking society, a world where sexuality wasn't just personal, it was political, spiritual, and often deadly, where the difference between honor and shame could be determined by who penetrated whom, and where that difference could literally mean life or death. Because in Viking society, your sexual role didn't just determine your pleasure, it determined whether you lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. Bjorn the blacksmith had spoken 3 words that would either kill him or save his reputation within the next 5 minutes. Standing in the crowded market square of 10th century Reykjavik, he'd just called Thorstein the wealthy Arga, sexually passive, unmanly, a man who took the woman's role in bed. In most cultures, these would be fighting words. In Viking Iceland, they were something far more dangerous. They were legal grounds for immediate murder. Thorstein's hand moved to his sword, and everyone in the marketplace took a step back. Not because they feared a brawl, but because they were about to witness something that Viking law explicitly protected, an honor killing triggered by sexual insult. What happened next would be perfectly legal, socially acceptable, and absolutely final. Picture a legal system where questioning someone's sexual performance carried the same penalty as accusing them of treason. The Icelandic law codes, preserved in medieval manuscripts, spell out this reality with chilling precision, calling a man Arga or Raga, terms describing sexual passivity or feminine behavior, justified immediate lethal retaliation. This wasn't a crime of passion that would be punished later. This was premeditated legal murder with a built-in defense. The victim's own words became the justification for his death, and the killer would walk away without facing any legal consequences whatsoever. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, states it clearly. A man has the right to kill for these 3 words if he calls him unmanly, or rag, or demonstrably homosexual. The law didn't require proof, didn't mandate a trial, didn't even suggest that the accused should have a chance to defend themselves. Viking society had created a sexual hierarchy so rigid that maintaining your position within it was literally a matter of life and death. Being labelled sexually passive wasn't just an insult, it was social execution that stripped away legal rights, property ownership, and the ability to participate in community life. A man marked as Aga lost the right to testify in court, carry weapons, or inherit property. He became what the Vikings called needing, a nothing person, someone who existed outside the protection of law and society. In a culture where survival depended on community support, this designation was often worse than death. So when Thorstein heard that fatal word, he wasn't just defending his feelings, he was defending his entire existence as a free man in Viking society. The marketplace fell silent as Thorstein drew his sword. Bjorn had perhaps 30 seconds to either apologize, fight, or die. But here's where Viking law created an impossible situation. Apologizing would confirm the insult's truth, fighting might prove you were indeed unmanly if you lost, and running would definitely mark you as a coward. Thorstein stepped forward, his blade catching the afternoon light. "You called me Aga in front of witnesses," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone invoking legal precedent. "The law gives me the right to answer with steel." Bjorn reached for his own weapon, but his hands shook. Not from fear of death, but from the crushing realization that he'd just triggered a legal mechanism designed to favor the accused. Even if he won this fight, he'd be known as the man who'd accused another of sexual inadequacy, hardly a reputation that would improve his own standing. This legal framework reveals something disturbing about how Viking society balanced individual honor against community stability. By making sexual insults punishable by death, they'd created a system where questioning someone's masculinity became more dangerous than accusing them of theft, fraud, or even assault. The sagas document dozens of these honor killings, often describing them with matter-of-fact language that suggests they were routine occurrences. The saga of Burnt Njal describes a conflict that killed dozens of people, all because one man questioned another's sexual performance. The Egil saga tells of warriors who traveled hundreds of miles to murder someone who'd called them unmanly. Archaeological evidence supports these literary accounts. Burial sites across Iceland contain remains of men who died from sword wounds in what appear to be single combat situations, often in public spaces where witnesses would have been present. Steel rang against steel as Bjorn and Thorstein fought in the crowded marketplace. But this wasn't just a duel between 2 men, it was a legal proceeding with spectators who would serve as official witnesses to whatever verdict the swords delivered. Within minutes, Bjorn lay bleeding in the dirt, killed not by a criminal but by a man exercising his legal rights under Icelandic law. Thorstein cleaned his blade and walked away, his masculinity publicly confirmed by his willingness to kill for it. But the violence didn't end there. Bjorn's family now faced their own impossible choice: accept their son's death as legally justified, or seek revenge and risk being branded as attackers of an innocent man. The law that had protected Thorstein now protected him from retaliation, creating a legal shield around honor killings that could extend the violence for generations. The crowd dispersed, but the message lingered. In Viking Iceland, sexual insults weren't just words, they were potentially fatal weapons that could trigger legal murder. This created a culture of careful speech where men monitored their language with the precision of diplomats, knowing that the wrong phrase could result in immediate death. Women learned to use these laws as weapons of their own. The sagas describe wives who destroyed their husbands' reputations by publicly questioning their sexual adequacy, knowing that other men might feel compelled to test those claims with steel. Divorce became a deadly game where sexual insults could literally eliminate unwanted spouses. Children grew up understanding that certain words carried more power than swords, and that reputation was worth more than life itself. Today, criminologists recognize what the Vikings had institutionalized: the connection between sexual identity and violent behavior. Modern hate crime legislation reflects similar understanding, that attacks on sexual identity can trigger responses far more extreme than other forms of insult. But the Vikings had taken this psychological reality and codified it into law, creating a legal system that essentially weaponized sexual insecurity. They'd discovered that the threat of emasculation could make ordinary men commit murder, and they'd built that discovery into their social structure. Dr. William Miller's research on honor cultures helps explain why these laws developed. In societies where reputation determines survival, attacks on sexual identity become attacks on the right to exist, justifying extreme responses that might seem incomprehensible to modern observers. These honor-killing laws influenced medieval European legal development for centuries. Similar provisions appear in law codes across Scandinavia, and Norse legal concepts spread with Viking expansion to Ireland, Scotland, and beyond. The idea that sexual insults justified violent response became embedded in European concepts of masculine honor, influencing everything from medieval chivalry to Renaissance dueling codes. What began as practical Viking law evolved into cultural assumptions about gender and violence that persist in modified forms today. The next time someone discusses toxic masculinity or the connection between gender identity and violence, remember Bjorn bleeding in that Icelandic marketplace. His death wasn't the result of personal hatred or random violence. It was the predictable outcome of a legal system that had decided masculine reputation was worth more than human life. The Vikings understood something that modern society struggles with, that sexual identity and social power are inseparably linked, and that attacks on one inevitably become attacks on the other. They chose to resolve this tension through legalized murder, creating a society where words could kill as efficiently as any weapon. Their solution was brutal, but it reveals truths about the relationship between sexuality and violence that remain relevant today. And these honor killings were just the beginning of how Viking sexual hierarchy shaped their society, because the same culture that made questioning masculinity a capital offense had also created an entire economy based on sexual slavery, where human beings were bought, sold, and used with the casual efficiency of any other commodity. Sometimes the most disturbing aspect of history isn't the violence itself, but how ordinary people learned to live with systems that made such violence seem reasonable. Bridget had been a farmer's daughter in County Cork just 3 weeks ago. Now she stood naked on a wooden platform in the Dublin slave market, her body being examined like livestock, while Viking traders discussed her value in terms that reduced her humanity to a simple economic calculation. The buyer, a Norse merchant named Olaf, ran his hands along her arms, checking for muscle tone. He examined her teeth, looking for signs of disease. He asked the seller about her virginity, her health, her ability to bear children, all factors that would determine her price in a market where human beings were bought and sold with the casual efficiency of grain or cattle. But Bridget wasn't destined for farm work or household service. The negotiations happening around her involved a different kind of labor entirely, one that would strip away not just her freedom, but her very sense of self. She was about to become part of an industrial-scale system of sexual exploitation that fueled Viking expansion across medieval Europe. Picture an entire economy built on human trafficking for sexual purposes. The Viking slave markets of Dublin, York, and Kiev weren't just side businesses. They were sophisticated commercial operations that treated human sexuality as a commodity to be harvested, processed, and distributed with the efficiency of any other trade good. Archaeological evidence from Dublin suggests that up to 30% of the city's population consisted of slaves, many captured specifically for intimate exploitation. The Vikings had created what modern investigators would recognize as the world's first organized sex trafficking network, complete with established trade routes, standardized pricing, and specialized markets. The scale was staggering. A single raid on an Irish monastery might yield dozens of young women and men who would be transported hundreds of miles to markets where their bodies would be evaluated, priced, and sold to the highest bidder. The Vikings had developed a classification system for human cargo that would make modern traffickers envious in its cold precision. Age, physical condition, virginity, and perceived compliance all factored into a slave's market value, creating a hierarchy that treated people like different grades of merchandise. Young women like Brigid commanded premium prices, especially if they showed signs of education or gentle upbringing. Viking buyers believed that enslaved nobility provided better entertainment than common peasants, paying extra for victims who understood exactly how far they'd fallen. The sellers had learned to maximize profits through presentation. Slaves were washed, their wounds treated, their hair arranged to hide signs of trauma. The goal was to create an illusion of willing participation, making buyers feel they were purchasing companions rather than victims. But beneath the market's civilized surface lay a brutal truth. Resistance was pointless, escape was nearly impossible, and survival depended on accepting a reality that transformed human beings into objects for others' pleasure. Viking law codes reveal the disturbing precision with which this system operated. The medieval Icelandic laws make clear distinctions between free women, who enjoyed extensive protection against sexual assault, and enslaved women who had no rights whatsoever. The legal code states explicitly that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while sexually assaulting a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The same legal system that protected free women's sexual autonomy explicitly denied that protection to the enslaved, creating a two-tier system that would make apartheid look progressive. Any free man could use a slave sexually without legal consequence. Resistance could be met with violence, and killing a slave for defiance barely qualified as a misdemeanor. The law had essentially created a class of people who existed outside human protection, available for any use their owners desired. Within hours of her purchase, Brigid discovered the reality behind the market's commercial facade. She'd been bought by a wealthy landowner who already owned 7 other enslaved women, each serving the same function in what amounted to a private collection of human beings reduced to sexual objects. Her new owner explained the rules with the casual tone of someone discussing household management. She would be available whenever desired, to whomever he designated. Resistance would be punished. Pregnancy would be managed according to his economic interests. Her previous life, her family, her own desires, none of these mattered anymore. The other enslaved women watched her arrival with expressions that mixed sympathy with resignation. They'd all traveled the same path, from normal lives to this existence where survival depended on accepting the unacceptable. Some had been there for years, their personalities gradually eroded by a system designed to break the human spirit. The Vikings had developed techniques for managing human property that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic conditioning. New slaves were deliberately isolated from others who shared their language or culture. They were given new names, cutting ties to their former identities. They were rewarded for compliance and punished for resistance in ways that gradually reshaped their understanding of what was possible. The most devastating aspect wasn't the physical abuse, it was the way the system convinced victims that their situation was natural, even deserved. Slaves who had been held for years often defended their owners, having internalized the belief that they existed primarily for others' pleasure. Some developed what modern researchers call trauma bonding, forming emotional attachments to their captors as a survival mechanism. Others simply retreated into psychological spaces where the body's experiences couldn't touch whatever remained of their essential selves. But the Viking slave trade wasn't just destroying individual lives, it was strategically dismantling entire societies. The systematic kidnapping of young women and men from Irish, Scottish, and English communities created demographic catastrophes that could cripple regions for generations. Villages that lost significant portions of their young population faced economic collapse. Families destroyed by the slave raids often scattered, unable to maintain traditional social structures. The psychological trauma of knowing that loved ones were suffering somewhere in Viking-controlled territories created a climate of fear that made normal life nearly impossible. The Vikings understood this perfectly. Sexual slavery wasn't just profitable. It was a weapon of conquest that destroyed enemy societies from within while providing both economic benefit and psychological satisfaction to the raiders. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly this system became normalized within Viking society. Free Norse women lived alongside enslaved women, often supervising their use and managing their owners' collections with the efficiency of household administrators. Children grew up seeing sexual slavery as a normal part of adult life. Young Viking men expected to have access to enslaved women as a standard privilege of their social status. The system had become so embedded in daily life that questioning it would have seemed as strange as questioning the weather. Religious authorities blessed these arrangements, treating the enslaved as divinely ordained servants whose suffering served higher purposes. The entire culture had developed elaborate justifications for treating human beings as property, creating moral frameworks that made brutality seem virtuous. Today, human trafficking investigators recognize patterns in the Viking slave trade that persist in modern sexual exploitation networks. The same techniques for breaking victims' spirits, the same economic calculations that treat human suffering as acceptable overhead, the same cultural blindness that allows communities to ignore systematic abuse happening in their midst. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were human beings who had developed cultural practices that allowed them to commit atrocities while maintaining their moral self-image. Their success came from understanding that sexual exploitation could be industrialized, systematized, and normalized if the proper social frameworks were established. The wealth generated by Viking sexual slavery helped fund their expansion across Europe. The profits from human trafficking paid for ships, weapons, and the military campaigns that brought more victims into the system. It was a self-perpetuating cycle that turned human suffering into the foundation of medieval Norse prosperity. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites shows clear correlations between slave trading centers and periods of economic growth. The bones found in these locations tell stories of lives cut short, dreams destroyed, and human potential converted into commercial profit with ruthless efficiency. The next time someone discusses human trafficking or wonders how ordinary people can participate in systematic abuse, remember Bridget standing on that platform in Dublin, watching her humanity be reduced to a price negotiation between strangers. Her story, and the stories of thousands like her, reminds us that some of history's greatest crimes weren't committed by monsters, but by people who had convinced themselves that treating others as property was natural, profitable, and even morally justified. The Vikings built an empire partly on the systematic destruction of human dignity, and they did it with the full participation of a society that had learned to see slavery not as tragedy, but as opportunity. And yet this same Viking society that treated enslaved women as disposable property had also created unprecedented rights for free women, legal protections and social freedoms that wouldn't appear elsewhere in medieval Europe for centuries. The contradiction reveals something unsettling about how human societies can simultaneously embrace liberation and oppression, often within the same legal framework. Sometimes the most disturbing aspect of history isn't the cruelty itself, but how selectively societies choose to apply their moral principles. And that's where we'll leave tonight's exploration. The Vikings created a civilization where sexuality wasn't just personal, it was political, legal, and often deadly, where the difference between honor and shame could be determined by who penetrated whom, and where that difference literally meant the difference between living as a respected citizen or dying as a social outcast. These weren't random acts of medieval barbarism, they were systematic approaches to power that used human intimacy as a tool of control, creating frameworks that influenced European law and social structure for centuries. The next time you hear someone romanticize the good old days, or wonder how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty, remember these stories. They remind us that human societies have always found ways to turn our most intimate experiences into instruments of dominance. If tonight's exploration resonated with you, let me know in the comments what surprised you most. And if you're ready to dive deeper into how sexuality and power intersected in ways that still influence our world today, there's more to discover. Until next time, remember that understanding the past isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about recognizing the patterns that shape how we live, love, and treat each other today. The blood may have dried, but the systems they created echo still. Sleep well.